I have harvested tomatoes and tobacco, flipped burgers, and bolted transmissions onto engine blocks at Chrysler's Windsor assembly plant. And in 1970, I joined the League for Socialist Action, a radical Canadian political group. These were some of my fellow League for Socialist Action members. I believe that it's urgent that their story be told. So in 2016, I began interviews with L.S.A. veterans about their activism 50 years ago.
The League for Socialist Action was a revolutionary Marxist organization which was inspired and driven by the ideas of the Russian Revolution.
The League for Socialist Action's roots lay with the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, the Russian Marxists who formed the first Soviet government in 1917. Leon Trotsky founded the left opposition to lead the struggle against Joseph Stalin's right-wing counter-revolution. The League for Socialist Action continued Trotsky's political ideas.
The League for Socialist Action, it was very well described by its name. It was an association of people who were socialists, wanted to advance the struggle for socialism, and wanted to do it through action.
The central idea of the League for Socialist Action was the concept of revolution. Now, this was important because we were in a very unrevolutionary society.
During the politically tumultuous 1960s and 70s, the League for Socialist Action became a significant force on the Canadian left.
The League for Socialist Action, interestingly enough, was founded the same time as the New Democratic Party.
There's a huge difference in operating as a revolutionary in Canada and operating as a revolutionary in the United States, in the sense that Canada has always had a social democratic tradition. It's always had this third party that has ostensibly spoken for socialism and the workers.
Everybody was encouraged to join the NDP, to take part in the riding associations, to try to get their riding associations to discuss political issues.
We were a very small group. How could we influence the revolution? Well, by going into a larger group and becoming members and trying to persuade the other groups and trying to recruit its members.
In its 16-year history, the League for Socialist Action and its youth group, the Young Socialists, altered the Canadian political landscape. But despite its prominence, by the late 1970s, the League had disappeared.
We would sing this song. And we also sang the Red Flag. You want to hear it?
Sure.
You want me to sing it?
Absolutely.
The workers' flag is deepest red. It shrouded oft our martyr dead. And ere their limbs grew stiff and cold, their heart blood dyed its every fold. So raise the scarlet banner high. Beneath its folds we'll fight and die. Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer, we'll keep the red flag flying here. I heard that every week growing up.
Whatever happened to the League for Socialist Action? They're so active, so successful.
It was a lovely organization. It's kind of like, in many ways I think of the L.S.A., I think about somebody shooting a rocket in the air, an exploding rocket, and then explodes beautiful colors and it just disappears into shit, right? And that's what the L.S.A. experience was in many ways for me.
Fabre said, well, you see, the difference is that you, the Trotskyists, you think that the Russian Revolution is relevant to reality in Canada today. And we in the NDP, we don't think it's relevant at all. And that's fundamentally what divides us. Well, I thought he hit the nail on the head.
It was an organization tied to the trade union, so it was a labor party, a social democratic party, theoretically, and a labor party in terms of its roots. It was tied directly to the trade unions.
The Trotskyist attitude towards the CCF and the NDP was a split personality type thing. On the one hand, we say they're reformists, right? But it's true of the leadership. It's true that the leadership and the trade union bureaucracy are a wing of the capitalist system. They're bought into it, right? So, but the rank and file is another matter.
We Trotskyists were all about trying to get people out into the streets, demonstrating and beginning to understand that they have to oppose these power structures around us. That in fact, you put forward reasonable demands, you mobilize a lot of people indicating that these reasonable demands have a lot of public support, and yet these government structures, these state structures, don't acknowledge it. And in fact, they do whatever they can to suppress them.
In that milieu, we were trying to recruit, build the young socialists, and B, influence the young New Democrats and the New Democratic Party to take stands that move the struggle forward.
Take the statement, which we put out as a 10-cent a copy pamphlet, sold everywhere. What is the L.S.A. and what does it want? And it says very clearly that we are a current in the New Democratic Party, and we are working to win the New Democratic Party to a socialist program, and that is our purpose. And if we have meetings outside the NDP, that's only because the leadership has been undemocratic and forced us to do so.
It would have been ideal if the NDP had allowed us to exist as a recognized tendency, political tendency in the party, but Social Democrats have always been hostile to that.
Trotskyists were hated because they were smart alecks. And because we did know more than other people, so it was hard to shake us all. Go away. Don't pay any attention to that person. That person is probably a trot.
So which was it? Were we building a revolutionary party or were we building the NDP? Well, both. We did not lack in sincerity in building the NDP. Yes, the NDP was part of the struggle for socialism. We said it there through a metaphor, which became famous, that the NDP is both in the way and on the way to socialism, both an obstacle and a step forward.
You got 30,000 votes, and I saw the vote for the Trotskyist candidate, Ross Dowson.
I'm an activist. I see that term used in the bourgeois press now all the time to describe people like me, revolutionaries, activists, persons who are part of it, who implement their deeds, their ideas. And that's what Marx, Engels, and Lenin, Trotsky talked to us about, action.
He comes back from the war and he's trying to establish Trotskyism as a forceful presence, particularly in Toronto. And he runs some very successful municipal campaigns where he runs for office in the late 40s, 47, 48, I believe. And he gets a very significant percentage of the vote, a bit above 20%. And he's running on an overtly Trotskyist program. I mean, one of the slogans is vote for the Trotskyist candidate. I mean, this is almost unheard of, right? To get 20%.
Ross Dowson was the executive secretary of the League and was his most prominent spokesman and one who wrote most of the articles for the paper and basically ran everything pretty much down the headquarters. He was the only person on staff through the 50s and early 60s.
I was reading about Zen Buddhism and the meditation that was associated with Zen Buddhism. And Ross asked me, what was the point of this? What's the purpose of meditation? And I said, well, I'm not sure, but presumably it allows you to tolerate the horrors on earth, the suffering and the starvation. It allows you to maintain a tranquil peace of mind in the midst of this. And Ross's answer to that was like a kick in the head. His position was that when I see human suffering, I am enraged. And anything that takes that rage out of you is stealing from you your very humanity.
This generation with this mindset, a very strong mindset of we're leaders, we want things to be better, we're on the leading edge, we're going to make things happen.
When you say, you were part of this revolutionary socialist group and it was democratic centralist and it believed the revolution was imminent, sounds kind of odd that so many people, so many talented people would be part of that, right? But it was kind of part of the time.
There was a very big divide between the 60s, 70s kids growing up and their parents generation. The incredible rigidity of that older generation that we came out of in the 60s and 70s. And so we rejected it. And we wanted to find joy and love and freedom, etc. And it felt like that we had to, in order to do that, we had to break with the older generation.
In Ontario high schools, many of our favorite books were informally banned. I was suspended for reading them. Military training, on the other hand, was compulsory. And girls who got pregnant just disappeared. "She's gone to an aunt's," was the standard explanation. And many were never seen again. Some 20 years after Rosa Parks refused to sit at the back of an Alabama bus, well into the mid-1970s, minstrel shows were still being staged in church halls all over Ontario. That's my father, seated in the front row.
I came from a very right-wing home, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, very pro the war in Vietnam, etc.
There was so much percolating throughout the decade. You had youth mobilized against war. You had important struggles against racism. You had realizations that, Native peoples in Canada had really been colonized and dispossessed in ways that really no generation prior to the 60s had seen.
There were all these things which happened at a time when people who normally would have been just starting to work in a plant somewhere or in an educational institution, learning to analyze politics in the world.
And my job was basically to go around campuses, mainly in Ontario, go to the university and try and get people interested in the Young Socialists. And within a day, I'd have a meeting and there'd be a dozen people who wanted to join the Young Socialists. And this happened even in some small towns.
The whole thing that people were doing in the 60s, where they were actually studying the ruling class and saying, this is who the ruling class are. Like, you need to name them, right? You need to name them, and then you need to say who they are. You need to know, this is how they made their money. This is where they live. Like, they need to be made into real people who do really bad things, right? And get a lot of privilege out of it.
I went down to the Communist bookstore and bought the Communist Manifesto. There were so many ideas in it. So that led from one thing to another. I started to think in more general terms about politics as an expression of ethical standards which I'd never questioned, really. Fairness, justice, things like that.
Something that still comes back to me is like from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs.
I think what really powered the whole 60s radicalization, what started it, was the civil rights struggle in the United States. And the anti-colonial struggle around the world. Because this posed things in very stark terms. Are you for equality or not? And most of the youth said, we're for equality.
So the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement really, really, really shaped me. And to this day, I think those were really formative events.
Ethical questions were big in our family. My father preached about them every Sunday, and we sometimes just talked about issues of the day at the dinner table.
And I think that was one of the most striking things about the Trotskyist movement. Like, people who are ordinary people, who are working people, think they have a historical role. Like, are you kidding me? Like, that's revolutionary, because nobody, when you're growing up poor working class, is ever supposed to think that you have a historical role of any kind.
Given what was happening in the 60s, it wasn't completely crazy that we thought the possibility of socialist revolution was in the air.
But all this explosion of hope that we, by our own efforts, could make society better, posed the question, are the social structures and are the political leaderships really worthy of our hope? And that was the force that threw individuals like me into radical opposition, that the social system and its institutions did not stand the test of our hopes, the test of our moral beliefs. That was a very radical conclusion to come to, but it was a radical conclusion locked in a very conservative society. And how could that contradiction be resolved? The way I resolved it, and I think this was typical of those who joined in the constitutive years of the L.S.A., I resolved it through internationalism.
The Cuban Revolution, 1959, the feudalistas win political power in Cuba, and very, very rapidly, within a space of 2 years or so, they created what the Trotskyists called a workers' state by kicking out the imperialist-owned corporations, nationalizing all major companies pretty well, and having a tremendous mobilization in opposition to the U.S., which of course was deadly opposed to the Cuban Revolution.
We had film showings and talks about Cuba, and many comrades spent time in Cuba, came back and talked about it. It was very exciting.
I went to Cuba in '63, and I decided I wanted to join the militia. But of course, they discouraged me, and they said, if you want to make the revolution, go home and make the revolution in Canada.
I got very involved in the occupation in front of the U.S. consulate during the Selma to Montgomery March, which was one of the important turning points in the civil rights movement.
So what we did was, about 40 of us, we sat down on the steps of the U.S. consulate. And it was in the fall, it was bitterly cold, and it got big TV and a lot of sympathy. And everybody started driving down to the U.S. consulate and handing us food and coffee and blankets, and their cameras were there, and the police were standing around not knowing what to do. It really was a tremendous event, which I always think of as the real starting point of student radicalization in Toronto. Like, from there, it never looked back.
Never has in history has there been a situation that exists today where there's an exchange of experience, exchange of ideas. It's just the beginning, of course, but it's a colossal development we're experiencing. Internationalism, there's never been such internationalism as it exists today in the world.
We want an internationalist world, obviously based on completely different premises. Something Marx recognized in a really interesting way. He said, you know, the struggle is first of all with our own bourgeoisie. So you have to struggle nationally, but you have to do it in a way that is sensitive to the international, and that your struggles create space for others. Your victories, even if they're partial, are part of, hopefully, other victories so that you can complete the move to socialism.
If we conceive of the world as a unified whole, in which every action everywhere in the world interrelates with all the other things going on, and so that whatever I do here in Canada, in a small way, has an impact on things happening elsewhere in the world, where the stakes are much bigger and the opportunities for change and progress are much more dramatic, then it is important what I do here, and what I do here can indeed be inspired by a revolutionary vision, even if that vision cannot be realized at this time in my own country. Because it can be realized. It can be realized by becoming an internationalist.
We had heard the American anti-war movement was going to hold a big demonstration on March the 26th, 1966. And we get talking about this. What should we do in Canada? Well, how about if we actually go to Ottawa for a demonstration? Fine, that sounds like a good idea. But how would we get there? And I don't remember who it was that said it. I've always hoped it was me, but I can't remember for sure. Somebody said, why don't we rent a train? And everybody said, oh my God, that's ridiculous. You can't rent a train. And we rented a train. It was about 4 cars or 5 cars. And we basically took a train load of people to Ottawa for a demonstration. The first big Canadian in Ottawa national demonstration with a train load of people.
That summarized exactly our attitude. We were prepared to do what it took with some imagination to break through the old sectarian practices and to try and meet the political needs of the working class at that time.
My experience in the anti-war movement was really my introduction to, certainly to the Trotskyist movement, certainly to radical politics. And then, don't forget, in those days, we saw the news at night on TV. It was the first really broadcast war. I can still see, and it almost brings tears to my eyes, Agent Orange being dropped on peasants. And I thought, no, you can't do that. That you can't do, you bastard.
I was reading the New York Times and it showed a picture of a GI who was this much taller than the little people he was hurting in front of him with his gun. And he was pushing them along into a strategic hamlet, which was obvious to me was a concentration camp. And I thought, this is exactly why we went to war with Hitler. And my own government is doing this to people? I couldn't believe it.
First Vietnam demonstration I was on was in June of 1964. It was down on the waterfront in Vancouver. First one of the first in North America, I think.
An American troop ship landed in Vancouver, was opened for visitors before going to Vietnam.
There was a huge crowd going on and off these American warships, right, or one of them anyway. And we went, as 14 of us, went up and down with our picket signs, get out of Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera.
We printed up leaflets explaining the war in Vietnam and what could be done against it and what your attitude should be, et cetera. That was directed at the sailors on that warship. And we would take the leaflets and stuff them inside our shirts and jackets. And there was me, I mean, I hadn't done anything like that before. Going on a warship with leaflets hidden under my jacket. So we walked through the ship and surreptitiously would put leaflets under the pillowcases, under the mattresses, wherever we could put those leaflets.
We attended one meeting about 1967 or 68, and it was a retired general from the United States Armed Forces. And he had parts of a napalm bomb. And he said, this is how the napalm bomb works. Inside each of these metal globes, there are fragmented razor blades and jellied gasoline. And then all these little shells are put inside a great big shell. And this is what is dropped by the Americans, by the American government on Vietnam.
Canada was selling arms, making a lot of money, billions of dollars in sale of arms to the United States for use against the Vietnamese.
From 1965 to 1973, 500 Canadian firms sold $2.5 billion worth of ammunition, napalm, Agent Orange, aircraft engines, and explosives to the Pentagon. Another $10 billion in food, clothing, nickel, copper, lead, oil, brass, plate armor, and military transport.
In those sales, many of them were negotiated with the assistance of Canadian embassies and Canadian diplomats, and the complicity was very, very direct. And we pointed that out all the time.
And I really understood the need to have clear statements, that that a mass number of people could relate to. And in Canada's case, because we didn't have soldiers fighting, it was end Canada's complicity in Vietnam.
A lot of people still think of it as a struggle for peace, but not for us. For us, it was a struggle to win a revolution. We didn't want peace in Vietnam. We wanted victory in Vietnam. We wanted the defeat of imperialism. It was no question. And it was a defeat for imperialism.
Where we were different from many in the anti-war movement was in that we called for not negotiations with the Vietnamese rebel forces, but immediate and unconditional withdrawal of the U.S. and Allied forces.
The demand we put forward was out now. The problem we felt with the negotiation demand was that you were conceding that imperialists had some right to be negotiating over the future of Vietnam.
Our slogans were always one that would bring in the most people, bring the troops home, whereas the ultra-left wanted, we support the National Liberation Front, you know, and how many Canadians were going to go along with, we support the National Liberation Front?
I remember one of the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist newspapers, the headline was, "Blood debts must be paid in blood." I mean, that's really going to reach a mass audience, guaranteed. And it's also stupid. You know, they must not always be paid in blood, whatever that means.
You want something that's very focused so that you're very clear on what you want. End the Vietnam War now. Bring the boys home.
The political differences that we had with the CP revolved around what the overall direction and movement of the peace movement should be. You know, the CP generally promoted things like peace now and negotiate.
But you see, the NDP leadership and the Communist Party members and leaders, they don't like masses of people in the streets.
In the anti-war movement, for example, it took a long time to convince the NDP leadership to come out against the Vietnam War. I don't think it was till about 1967 or 68. And of course, we had the Stalinists to contend with there.
Our fire had to be aimed at our governments. And the only demand on our governments that would make a difference for the Vietnamese and for American soldiers, mostly young men, mostly non-white young men, was stop this war and pull your troops out. Get out of there, leave those people alone. Their bicycles aren't going to come across the Pacific Ocean and attack California.
There was no reason to invade Southeast Asia. You know, the people of Southeast Asia had a right to be to make their own decisions.
They were defeated there, and it was largely because of the anti-war movement, and of course the effect it had on the GIs, and the GIs were growing more and more opposed to it, and the officers were getting fragged there. You know, they were getting assassinated by their own soldiers. The disobedience. There was a revolt in the army. It was a conscript army.
The Vietnam War was won by the Vietnamese in the early 1970s.
I think it's the first time in modern history that a major imperialist country has had to buckle under and has been defeated by a miserable small country. You know, Charlie. They didn't even call them Vietnamese. They called them Charlie.
Some of the guys invited me to an anti-war conference where they were making decisions about how to organize the protests against the war. And I found them really impressive as a group. They operated as an organized group within this anti-war conference, and they pushed for things that I completely agreed with about immediate withdrawal of troops from Vietnam and various things like that. And my friend, who had been a member of the Communist Party, his reaction was, those damn trots, they take control of everything. And I said to myself, well, if they're that good, I want to be part of them.
I remember going to one of my profs, who was actually my tutorial leader in political science, who was a leftist, and I said to him, you know, do you have to join the Trotskyists to organize against the Vietnam War? Like, I can't find anybody else who's doing it.
The Trotskyist movement played, I think, an important role in the war in Vietnam. They were very active. I mean, people hated them a lot, but they did help to organize it. And also the idea that you could build a broad coalition.
We recognized the importance of trying to get these people on side in order to make it a bit easier for ordinary working people to come out on a demonstration without feeling that they were going to be victimized by it.
They're all marching together. They're all working together in the same movement. And I think the Trotskyists really did promote that idea of the, united front.
Well, we actually advertised that these were to be peaceful demonstrations because we wanted the broadest number of people to feel comfortable coming and joining us. We trained people to be security and to do it in a non-violent way, that they would move in, surround troublemakers, surround provocateurs, surround anarchists or whoever that were starting to do something, and move them away from the mass of people.
There's the practical side, because you're organizing a mass demonstration. We became really expert at this. I mean, really mass. I mean, 10,000, 15,000 people in City Hall Square in Toronto. Demonstrations of same size in Vancouver and so on. Big demonstrations in Ottawa.
I particularly remember going out and postering for the International Days of Protest against the war in Vietnam, and they happened like clockwork every fall and every spring.
And then, of course, there's actually organizing the demonstration itself. It was just massive amounts of physical labor. There was nothing intellectual about it.
We were, out on the streets at night, and somebody would mix up the wallpaper paste. Somebody would get the posters. We'd be assigned a driver because we were all too young to drive, and a driver would take us around, and we'd have a lookout for cops, and we'd put these posters up.
We were the people in the L.S.A. and the Young Socialists who did the hard work. And it's one of the ways to take leadership is to do the work.
When I got into the Vietnam Mobilization Committee, I had to organize demonstrations, and I had to speak with the media, and I had to travel around the country showing films and giving presentations, dealing with debates, and dealing with Maoists and Communist Party members who wanted to break up our meetings.
The best cadre and organizers often were the Trotskyists, and deserve a lot of credit for that, and I think they carried those skills into a lot of other places, including in the reproduction rights struggle. The Trotskyists were often the best organizers. The thing that was admirable in the reproduction rights struggle, in the anti-war struggles, was the anti-imperialist struggles generally, was the ability of Trotskyists, the commitment of Trotskyists, to be out there organizing the demonstrations.
Every successful movement, every successful organization has a leadership. Nothing happens without leadership. Things don't just happen. They are achieved. And they're achieved by people who have a vision or who collaborate with others to create an effective vision, who are team builders, who are strategists. And the sort of anarchist idea that we're just all going to come together and, create a new world or something is naive, to say the least.
The focus of all the political work of the L.S.A. was always around quote-unquote single issue, coalitions around single issue. I would give that early Trotskyist movement the credit for saying that I think that was a positive when it came to anti-war organizing, because it did allow for coalition building.
Yeah, I was so proud to be part of the anti-war protests, the time of the Vietnam War, to be able to go to those huge protests and to be able to actually end the war.
When I was in Vietnam, people would say to me, "Why are you so interested in this war?" Because they figured maybe I'm an American, I'm a vet or something like that. And I said, "No, I'm a Canadian, but I was one of the organizers of the anti-war movement." And their reaction to me was, "Thank you." That's what they said. They said that you made a difference.
The essence of politics is you have to intervene. There is a struggle going on and you have to have something to say. How can we move this forward? How can we help you?
The idea that you have something and you debate it, vigorously and loudly and passionately, looking at every conceivable angle, and then you make a decision and you go out united.
Democratic centralism is an idea that's associated with communists or Bolsheviks, but actually it's just a normal way that every organization in the world functions. In the Liberal Party, they have 101 points of view, and they decide when they're going to run an election, they're only going to have one point of view.
There's no question that there's always going to be tension between the need to be unified and work together and the ability to be open and to hear all points of view. So there's a tension between democracy and centralism.
There was no place for public speaking in Toronto. People tried to do public speaking in Allen Gardens and got arrested. But Milton Acorn put together a group of poets, and they started going to Allen Garden on Sunday mornings and standing up and reading poetry.
They got together and they read their poetry contrary to one of the bylaws of the City of Toronto that the police were all too happy to try and enforce.
We adopted the tactic of as one speaker was pulled down by the police, another one would jump up and start speaking. So we were all arrested one by one by one.
And it made the cops look stupid because they were arresting poets. It got in the papers nationally.
We took the initiative basically in fighting for the right to free speech. We got the laws basically overturned so that you had free speech in Allen Gardens.
When we started postering for the Vietnam War, police were chasing us. It was illegal. And so were demonstrations that left the sidewalk. And then there was talk about getting a permit. And then once we led people onto Yonge Street without the permit. We stretched out the boundaries of public space and public discourse in a really, really important way. We set up precedents for use of Yonge Street, being in public space, taking over City Hall Square.
It's actually through the Young Socialists and the connection with the League for Socialist Action that I learn about the We Demand demonstration, which is the first lesbian and gay rights demonstration on Parliament Hill.
Even coming out to your friends and relatives was a great act of bravery back in those days. Because to come out in those days could have meant losing your job or being thrown out of your apartment. So to become a full-out, on-the-street, public gay activist took a great deal of courage.
We actually had a considerable influence in the emerging gay movement. I mean, our training in the Trotskyist movement made it possible for us to actually be better organizers.
Chat came along and supported our demo up in Ottawa in '71, which was sort of the beginning activist pan-Canadian activity. It was against federal laws. That was August 28, 1971.
As we started to emerge as the major leadership within the teachers movement, more and more teachers came to the Fraction, the group of teachers that were organized inside the L.S.A. to get the analysis, to have an understanding and a debate of which way forward.
We had about 40 teachers in Toronto and led mass demonstrations around teachers' rights and educational rights and the rights of students.
And I think it was about 30,000 plus that came to Queen's Park. And then later to a mass rally in Maple Leaf Gardens, which flowed out onto the streets. That transformed the teachers. That turned them immediately from professional organizations into trade unions, and they've never looked back.
The passionate movement in Quebec for independence was a direct challenge to the Canadian state. And given the stimulus of a couple of kidnappings by extreme nationalist forces, the Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, declared the War Measures Act. So we organized a picket line in front of the base saying, Canadian Army go home, Québec libre, and all that in French, of course, with a French language leaflet, and stood there in front of the base, handing out the leaflet to passers-by, and did that for a few hours until the newspapers had a chance to arrive, and it was reported, and there were no arrests. The Army did nothing.
It was a calculated provocation to prove that we could do these things, that they would not dare step against us. And it had quite an impact on radicals in Montreal that we could get away with that.
There was this Royal Commission on the Status of Women, and it seemed like a big governmental body looking at what's wrong with the way we treat women in Canada. And of course, there were, a bazillion things wrong.
When the women's liberation movement got going, we were actually on its leading edge. If you read the submission we made to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in the late 60s, it has most of the basic ideas of feminism as it's later developed.
It was this massive parliamentary committee meeting, and there were Rosie and I talking about how capitalism was the cause of all evils. And we needed, a whole bunch of things, equal pay for work of equal value, and childcare, and choice on abortion, and all kinds of things like that.
Daycare. Our organization helped many people organize around daycare.
We occupied that daycare center for a year and a half, around the clock. Now, this was at a time when it was pretty clear they weren't going to call the cops in on children.
Didn't know what the fuck to do about it, right? There were a whole bunch of women and babies and saying, "We want daycare."
We demonstrated against the Miss Toronto pageant. It was sponsored by the Toronto Police Association in those days. And I can remember going down to the CNE with these big placards with a photograph of a woman all cut into cuts of meat. We were catcalled, we were harassed. I look at the women I knew at that time. I mean, we were all young, and just being young makes you beautiful, but we turned into the ugliest bitches as far as people were concerned. I mean, we were spat on, we were called names, we were heckled. And I think that had a really radicalizing effect on me. How something that simple could be that threatening.
We spent a lot of time selling newspapers at street corners, participating in protests, forming united action committees, defense committees on this and that. We were active in factories, in offices, in unions, in many, many different areas of society.
And if you weren't at work, you were at the organization. You were down and you were making placards, or you were preparing banners, or you were at a meeting, or you were telephoning people, or you were out selling the paper. And it's only now I look back and I think, we were all in our 20s. We had this whole headquarters. We had our own printing equipment. We ran our own organization. That is a massive accomplishment for a group of 20-year-olds.
I came to this organization which had a building. There were older people around, people who could have been my parents, with children who were there. And it just seemed like, it was a normal sort of thing to be a radical, to be a Marxist.
But there was no real sense that this is women's work, this is men's work. Men should be leaders, women should be followers. None of that.
There was a sense of a tremendous equality, of sharing leadership, and that impressed me. I was aware of it because I was reading about women's liberation, and I was concerned about learning leadership skills.
My experience in the organization from day one was that they encouraged women comrades to participate, especially I would say in the youth movement. They were always trying to get you to write, to get you to speak, to get you to read, to get you to lead forums.
I didn't know that I was could be good at chairing meetings. I became a very good chairperson of meetings. I had never been a public speaker. It turned out that I could do that quite well.
I became a successful writer, speaker, public intellectual, entrepreneur, businessman. And I suppose I could have gone to Harvard Business School to get my training, but it would have been far inferior to the training I got being in the Trotskyist movement. And the organization was extraordinary in terms of the kind of strategic thinking that went on there, but also in terms of the management and leadership culture that existed.
It seemed that there were so many comrades at the time with a lot of talent for singing and dancing and acting, creative people.
And we had fun. We had Oberlin, we had Camp Poundmaker, we had wonderful people in that movement, some of the brightest and the best that I've ever met.
What the movement also contributed to me most significantly was an explanation of how my past came to be, how fascism could bamboozle the Germans, and that was only enabled by my understanding of Trotsky and his interventions, not only in the form of the revolution, Betrayed, explaining Stalinism, but also his writings at the time about the failure of the German Revolution, the failure to stem the rise of Hitler.
We would organize teach-ins on the campuses and generally got our best response on the campuses and used those as our base for organizing and drawing in church groups, community groups, constantly fighting to try to draw in trade unionists and constantly trying to get NDP spokespeople to attend any of the demonstrations, to speak at it.
Similarly, on women's struggles, women's rights struggles, the abortion struggle, or anything, NDP leadership never wanted to take a position on anything that was controversial.
Birth control was illegal until 1969. You know, I can remember going to try and get the birth control pill in 1969, and they called us all Mrs., you know, sitting in the room waiting to get the birth control pill, and they kept calling out Mrs. Grant, which to me was my mother. I didn't even answer them when they said it.
In 1967, I went to the University of Toronto Health Centre to get the pill, and they wouldn't give it to me unless I had an engagement ring.
When I left my first husband and moved back to Toronto, I could not get an apartment without a man, someone in my family, my father or somebody, signing for me.
I found out, to my shock and horror, that they streamed girls out of science and math classes in schools.
It's difficult today to even find the language that we had to explain what we felt was this oppression, you know, floating down and covering us and covering everything we did. And we hadn't won abortion rights. Daycare was very, very small number of institutions. Equal pay was not an issue. The glass ceiling was much more powerful than it is today. Most of my profs were men. The rulers of the university were men. The rulers of society were men.
You go back and you look at the sort of social struggles here in North America in the 60s. You know, you had the whole new left was dominated by men.
I did a year of graduate work at Brandeis University.
And the chairperson of the department where I studied philosophy, was a member of the Frankfurt School. His name was Herbert Marcuse. He was an interesting guy, but at the end of the school year, I happened to be walking down a hallway in a classroom building, and I came across him by accident. He said, "So, you have done well, but there is no place for girls in academic life, so you will please not come back."
Their concept of the sexual revolution was that women should just simply make themselves available.
There was a spoken and unspoken expectation that sexual activity would be free and easy and recreational, so to speak. I can remember being shown a bookcase of books by a man. It was his bookcase, and it was filled with feminist books. And he said to me, "It's the best way I know how to get laid."
There was lots of that around. But the women who were part of our movement were incredibly effective at teaching us some things. They put up with a lot, I think, a great deal.
Male dominance is a part of our culture, so I find it everywhere. It doesn't surprise me that we had a male-dominated movement. And should I show you my shirt? This is not exactly a feminist t-shirt with these two guys on. I mean, I'm happy to wear it, but it's an example of a male-dominated liberation movement.
Historically, the revolutions tended to be sparked and initiated by women struggling. The Russian Revolution started with women's demonstrations.
Like so many women, I know, that we all know, I was sexually assaulted. The whole experience reinforced my passion and commitment to issues of violence against women. I knew I wanted to devote a lot of my life to working to end violence against women and to support rape victims. And it taught me something about my own ability to not remain the pacifist that I considered myself, because I believed that if anyone ever tried to hurt me again, I knew that I could kill. And that was a huge turning point for me as well.
New York was very dangerous in 1969, and especially for women. I got sexually harassed all the time, constantly. And I mean, like, serious, flashers, people grabbing me. So, but I didn't want to give up my freedom. So what I decided to do was make a scene, because you know how New Yorkers, they never mind their own business. It's not like Toronto. You yell in New York, put your prick back in your pants, you asshole. The people come around, right? So that's what I did. I started to fight back. And I really I started to enjoy it even, right? Because, they were just all scared shitless, right? Because nobody ever did that, right? So, so I was free.
The feminist movement brought the notion that the personal is political into the left. It's an powerfully important notion.
I think everybody in the room at one point, there were maybe 8 female comrades. Everyone had had an illegal or unsafe abortion. Everyone had been sexually harassed. Almost everybody had been raped. We were mobilized around this, and because it was very much in our minds political. It was about oppression by a society that didn't, respect or give due rights to women.
And they set up a group in Toronto, Women's Liberation Movement, WLM. We were pariahs in this group often. We wanted to turn it into a place for mass organizing, which they clearly weren't interested in. They were more interested in discussion, but it was interesting discussion, let me tell you. It was fascinating.
We participated in consciousness raising too, because we were
we were in favor of doing that too, understanding our oppression, where it came from, and it gave us a chance to talk about our ideas too.
It was pre-political as opposed to political, but we were totally driven to doing it, and we hadn't had that experience. This was not what the comrades wanted out of that group. It was not. It was what I personally needed and what many of the women in that room needed.
They had all sorts of consciousness raising, like women would come down there thinking, oh, well, let's see what this is about. And by the end of the meeting, they were getting ready to leave their husbands.
At one point, it was sort of the beginning of radical feminism. You know, the whole thing about the enemy is the men. And so at one point, at one meeting, there were a group of women who stood up and said they demanded to be heard. And they announced that they were radical feminists and that they were lesbians and that they were against having relationships at all with men, and that basically it was a sellout to be involved with men, and that they wanted to announce this. So there was total silence in this room, you know.
Most of my friends were men. You know, I constructed myself to be quite male because that's what we did, you know. When we wanted power, you know, you constructed yourself to be very male, act like a man. And I liked men, you know. I didn't have any anger toward men at all, particularly. So I didn't like the anti-male stuff. I thought it was stupid.
The Toronto Women's Caucus was perfect for its time because it really spoke to a lot of women in a way that initially may have been fairly non-threatening.
The socialist women among my friends always had good, succinct arguments, and people were afraid of them a little bit, I think.
It was founded very much on the basis of the need for action, the need for political action.
I'm thinking about the discussion about whether consciousness raising as opposed to political action and what the difference was. I remember a lot of discussions about that famous phrase, the personal is political. And for us to be able to get together and share experiences is a politicizing event. We're not marching, we're not holding up banners, we're not demonstrating, but we're sharing experiences that are politicizing us by sharing them. And so the Toronto Women's Caucus was an important part of that.
It wasn't all we did, because we were trying to figure out where the next organizing moment was going to be, but we did do it, and it was not important to the rest of the movement. But don't forget, we were women facing these ideas for the first time.
The abortion movement met our criteria for how you build a movement. It was national, not local. It had a political objective. You had to change the law. And it was a yes or no kind of thing. So it was perfect to build a campaign around.
But why we picked that issue, because there were lots of issues. There was equal pay for equal work and childcare and all these other issues, was that it was at the core of it was the right of women to have the most elemental control over their own bodies. Without that, there is no women's freedom. There is no women's rights. So if you can't even control your own body, I don't care what other rights you have. You don't have freedom.
It made sense to me to focus on reproductive rights because, you know, women go through menstruation every month. Every month you can be worried that you might be pregnant. It's really in your bones, in your body, this anxiety. Am I pregnant? Am I not? What do I do? And this was at a time when abortion was totally illegal. And it was really a life or death situation for women.
The main thing I saw about a woman's right to choose was the word choose. And I thought, you know what? I don't have to have an abortion this minute myself. I don't ever have to have one if I find abortion itself a problem. That's okay. It's about everybody, not just me. And of course, as time went on, then I began to, oh my God, abortion rights for women, that challenges everything out there. Everything. Oh my. It challenges the patriarchy. It challenges governments at all levels. And by God, it challenges the church. Hallelujah. I'm in.
The L.S.A. decided at a certain point to disband the TWC, the Toronto Women's Caucus, which we had worked in and developed and sunk a lot of resources in, and build the movement for abortion law repeal.
So that was the issue we picked. That was our approach always. What is the core issue? What issue will take us deepest into the nature of capitalism, and what will weaken capitalism the most? And therefore give women the greatest burst forward of freedom.
I was hugely influenced by the abortion caravan as we went up to Ottawa to meet these group of women who'd come across the country from Vancouver, and it was incredibly exciting.
And they thought that if they went to the legislature, if they went to Parliament, Parliament would say, oh, we had sort of overlooked you before, but now that you bring it to our attention, okay, we'll fix that.
And we took part in a demonstration that went down Spark Street Mall and it ended up on Trudeau's front lawn. And I was like, this is the most exciting thing I've ever done. And we heard that he was in town and probably in the House. With all sincerity, I was waiting for the Prime Minister of Canada to come out and talk to us.
This didn't happen, but it made a big splash.
We had lots of important things to say, and he never came. And that, again, was one of those moments of radicalization for me. And I think those kind of experiences helped me to realize there was something a lot deeper going on in terms of the state and its treatment of women. I mean, this was not long after Trudeau said the state has no business in the bedrooms of the nation. But it was still in the days where birth control was illegal.
When they got back, and they all wanted to do something different, but the L.S.A. women said, hey, this is silly. We got somewhere. We at least woke people up and attracted people to the women's movement through our abortion caravan, and that is the issue we should stick with. And they said, you trots. So there was a big split. They threw the trots out.
You know, the women's movement was not an in-the-street movement by and large, except in the pro-choice movement. It's very controversial. Like, a lot of people hated the trots. They just hated them, right? Because they were, you know, intervening.
That happened in all the movements that I was in. There's certainly different points of view, and what should the focus be, and what should our strategy be? How are we gonna get our demands met?
Well, I think some of the most interesting times for me in the movement was when we debated things like what slogans should be taken forward. And I can remember around the abortion movement, we had 3 very separate slogans that we debated. One was, every mother a willing mother, every child a wanted child. And I think with every mother a willing mother, every child a wanted child, you could easily get into the area of poverty, daycare, you know, you could get into all sorts of other issues in terms of reasons why children weren't wanted. One was free abortion on demand. When you talk about free abortion on demand, it was out there for most people. Like, what does that actually mean? I can remember being on a call-in show in Saskatoon when I was on this cross-Canada tour, and the disc jockey talked to me about, well, you're just suggesting that women should be able to go down to the corner store and get an abortion just like they get an ice cream cone.
You know, it fed into the anti-choice propaganda, like, we want abortion clinics on every corner or something.
There was this sense that if we gave women this right, that they would use it frivolously. They would use it as a method of birth control. That was the big argument. Oh yes, let's just rush off and have an abortion. And I think that was really radicalizing for a lot of women too, in terms of the disrespect that it showed for what we would go through over something like that. You know, something that is an intensely private experience that was being forced into the public domain. and one was repeal the abortion laws. We had tremendous debates around that. We eventually went forward with repeal the abortion laws, which I still think was the right decision because it was very concrete, it was measurable, it was repeal those laws.
We did not make up that demand. That demand comes from, the base of that is masses of women who were fighting for their right to not die in backstreet butchers.
It was organizable of women right across the political spectrum. You could be young, you could be old, and we turned up generations of older women who'd had terrible experiences with this law. So it was the model demand.
Tell it like it is, sister, tell it like it is. This isn't the first time we've marched on Parliament Hill demanding repeal of the abortion laws. Many of us have marched here 2, 3, many times. Control our lives, control our lives. And every time we come here, the right to life is here. And every time there's a few more of them. But every time there's a few more of them, there's tens and hundreds more of us. Because the very fact that they feel forced to demonstrate here is a sign of our strength. It's a sign of our growing numbers. Because not only they, with their antiquated ideas, feel threatened, this government feels threatened by our struggle, by our movement, by our demands. This is the government that passed the War Measures Act. This is the government which sends arms to Vietnam. This government does not represent us. And we're saying to this government that we demand that you repeal the abortion laws now. And we're building a movement.
I was not welcome after a while in the NDP Women's Caucus. Michelle Landsberg, Jackie Larkin were felt hostile to me, and I wanted to say, look, so I'm a member of the L.S.A., so what, right? But they didn't go for that, so that didn't work.
I was twice expelled from the NDP, so you can understand I might have some doubts about its seriousness about left-wing ideas.
And also, that we won the Ontario Federation of Labour Convention to support the Morgentaler Clinic when the NDP wasn't supporting it. That time the NDP wasn't supporting it.
Our commitment was to politics. So that was what held us together, and that was what we were there for, and everybody there knew it.
It was in 1973 in Toronto, and Dr. Morgentaler, at a meeting in front of hundreds and hundreds of people, declared that he had been providing abortions to women for months and months and months, and the law had to change. That really put the wind in the sails of the campaign, and women responded to defend him because he was putting his life on the line, his career on the line.
Particularly in the pro-choice movement, the Trotskyist movement was very strong. I mean, it was a war, right? Like it wasn't, and I've never been in a struggle like that before or since. Not only were there fanatics on the other side, but there was also, the government, the courts, like everybody was on the other side at first.
First of all, let's not minimize what we've won in abortion rights. Canada does not have a federal abortion law. It's one of the few countries in the world that does not have a federal abortion law. We won that. And no political party, even 10 years of Stephen Harper, could not table another abortion law without knowing that he would touch a rock and it would be political suicide.
There's still women who urgently need abortions, and they're able to go get them in Canada, and I'm so proud of that.
Abortion is the issue, the single issue that we're going to fight for, because we could win it, and of course we did.
Through a fight for abortion rights, you realize, okay, finally I have control to, my own reproductive system. And then you realize, why did I have to fight for that again? Like, how is it even a thing that, women have to defend their own bodies?
After the war, it spent an awful lot of time trying to separate itself from communists and from the left, so to be legitimate. Played a horrible role in a lot of ways, supporting the kicking out of people who were communists, Trotskyists, but that also meant anybody who could be identified with them. And the destruction of the left by the NDP was a factor in weakening the labor movement.
They do not really see themselves as a Labour Party wanting to take class control over the state apparatus. And many of them don't even believe or picture the need for the NDP to take power.
I think it was in 1984. It was the 50th anniversary of the CCF. And there was a manifesto that they were going to have that was going to, of all things, take the word socialism out of the NDP thing and, deliberately place it as a non-socialist capitalist reform organization, which of course they were in reality and were then and have been ever since.
If the NDP isn't a socialist party, can it be made into one by going into it?
If anybody has any illusions about the future of the NDP, it was a display of the most amazing kind of energy, determination, and youthfulness.
The most open workers and the most radical ones don't go in the NDP. So it's not, that part of it isn't true anymore.
That's one of our challenges as an NDP, to appeal to Canadians, to reform our electoral process, to free it from the yoke of money-buying elections.
Going into the NDP always seemed to me a mug's game because there wasn't that much going on there.
So our approach to radicalizing forces was always, we should remain within the NDP to the extent possible. That doesn't mean we have to pay all that much attention to working in it, but we should be there. We should not give up on it because the working class is not ready to give up on it. The history of the L.S.A., we were most of the time trying to figure out who we were. How do we become a different kind of organization that's broader, with a broader following of working people? And it's in that framework that we hit the question of our split back in 1973 with the forces that were then organized as the Revolutionary Marxist Group.
The L.S.A. had a working class orientation and had a history of its militants building caucuses in the Teamsters Union and other unions in meatpacking and out west in mining and the fishery. It's not a story that's very well known, but they didn't talk much about it in Toronto, in the Toronto branch. We were looking for a more radical, cutting edge, and not seeing it, we tried to manufacture it in the form of the RMG.
We're discussing a period in the middle and late 1960s, a period in which the League for Socialist Action was growing very rapidly.
A lot of people came in because they were the best anti-war activists, they were the best women's activists.
The working class had not begun to move in its millions. Other social layers, especially young people from all classes, were motivated by, ecology, feminism, anti-imperialism, anti-war sentiment.
We were mass action-oriented people. We were oriented to reaching the rank and file of the working class. Student radicals were not concerned about this at all. But at the same time, they were a creative and dynamic force that we could not turn our back on.
They were probing Gramsci and Marcuse, and I was studying all this myself, and they were dealing on a level of ideas that was actually not really respected within the old L.S.A.
You could tell us on the street by the way we dressed. The L.S.A. comrades dressed more like workers. The RMG comrades dressed more like beatniks.
The counterculture really did, and the youth culture really did influence the Revolutionary Marxist group.
That meant that they were, in a way, inclined by their very situation in society and by the fact that workers were not prominent in the radical movement at that time, to be a bit ultra-left, to think that small groups and small actions could push us forward better than anything else. Student radicalization was a bunch of ideas, of radical ideas, which were generally excellent, and also a bunch of moods and a culture that was somewhat hard to cope with from our point of view.
It involved playfulness and you know, just a whole set of like ways of reaching people, like theatrical, through music. It involved all those aspects. And I think that's the way that youth culture influenced the Revolutionary Marxist group.
We in the L.S.A. had had a lot of trouble from the police. A lot of members had been victimized and harassed. Visits to their job, for example, to get them fired and so on. So we were very careful not to give any ammunition to the police. And so we decided that if you were a member of the L.S.A., you could not smoke, you could not utilize illegal drugs. That means, above all, marijuana. With the RMG, it was quite a different matter. They thought this was just the most absurd thing in the world. And there was no way they were going to go into an organization that told them they couldn't smoke marijuana.
The L.S.A. was a different generation from us. Like, we were the 60s generation, and they were a bit older, so they're kind of square. And they, of course, they didn't like us much either, because, you know, they had lived through McCarthyism, and, you know, we were into drugs, sex, and rock and roll, you know, like we were a little too not serious for them.
Like, it was the least fun thing to be a hated Trotskyist, but it's seemingly the most effective. And, you know, I would have really, you know, it would have been way more fun to just be in the other groups that were cooler and had more interesting people.
But the problem is, as developed as they were there, they were tactical babies. And this was, and I knew it all the way along. They're the people I want to hang with, but they're not going to organize anyone over here.
The L.S.A. was a very capable, organizationally adept party which could develop and sustain campaigns, serious campaigns on a cross-country basis. We didn't have, the RMG had no such capacity.
Looking back retrospectively, I would say the more serious organization was the League. The less serious organization was the RMG. And I regret had I known, and I think a lot of us who left the League at the time, had we known what we were getting into, we might not have gotten into it.
The LSA's focused on reproductive rights, women's right to choose abortion, and supported and worked with Henry Morgentaler in that effort, and opening abortion clinics and defending the clinics from right-wing and bigoted attack. The RMG, including its women, leading women members, tended to look down their noses at this as being a kind of a rigid, legalistic, constrained field of struggle, that there was much more to be fought for and won.
Varda, I remember, got up at one RMG meeting and thought that it was horrible to think of going into the working class because the working class was culturally impoverished.
Because the New Left was also classless. And classless politics are not politics. Classless politics are just fucking hot air.
In retrospect, I felt I had a disdain for the L.S.A. traceable to petty bourgeois attitudes and to a certain intellectual snobbery, if I have to make a confession.
The problem is that the youth essentially took over the League, and it drained away all the energy into that, what was an extremely volatile milieu. And it left our trade union work to die on the vine, and that's what it did. It just died.
How do you build a working class organization when you got no working class people?
A key difference had always been the New Democratic Party. The Revolutionary Marxist group wanted to have nothing to do with it.
And of course, I wasn't interested in the NDP. I was too left-wing.
I would say in the case of the RMG split, it was both personal and political immaturity. The forward group split was something of a different order.
So the lawful experience was one where there's a left wing that developed within the New Democratic Party. And these people were influenced by Canadian nationalism, which in reality, as Ross Dowson pointed out, was a form of anti-imperialism.
They were a Canadian nationalist current within the NDP that we supported, that we went into, that we joined and built and promoted because they were the left wing of the NDP such as it was.
Somebody said, this country is owned by the USA, like you would say, yeah, like what else is new? Like, what was your first hint? Like, was it when you drove through suburbia and there's nothing but chain restaurants owned in the United States? Or what was it that gave you that insight? Was it that Inco is owned in the US? Like, what was your first hint? Like, why would you think this thought other than that it expresses material reality, right?
And the nationalism thing, this was really in the air at that time. There is no question. English Canadian nationalism had become a major, major force in the left. And to go against that, you paid a price for that.
All of a sudden, the positions advanced were not unconditional support of the NDP, but conditional support. And he saw also that there were articles being published that attacked Canadian nationalism as bourgeois.
President Nixon had detonated a bomb, an atomic bomb off the Aleutian Islands in Chitka. And that bomb ran, the line ran through Canada. The fault line, which could potentially cause an earthquake, ran through Canada. And still they went ahead with it. 1 million Canadians from coast to coast stood up and sang "O Canada." You know, I was so impressed. This was exciting stuff. And I remember Ross giving a speech on this. And he said, comrades, this is an elemental form of anti-imperialism. He said, yeah, they sing "O Canada." Would you expect them to sing the red flag?
That was the objective reason for this accommodation on Ross's part. And also he did it with, of course, with some subtlety, that he did not simply say Canadian nationalism was correct. He said Canadian nationalism was reactionary, but that there was an anti-US imperialist sentiment in Canada, and that was progressive. If there was ever a proof that Ross's position was correct, it was the waffle, because the waffle had emerged precisely around the question of Canadian independence, for an independent socialist Canada, with the accent on independence.
And when we saw the literature that had been produced, the original slogan was that the waffle was the movement for independence and socialism. But the literature was almost completely nationalist, with almost no mention of socialism.
The L.S.A. leadership, in all their media and all their personal statements and in their informal statements off the record, were very hostile and aggressive and towards the waffle, which I considered a very powerful and great and inspiring movement. They were regularly on the front page of the Toronto Star. L.A.C. ran for the leadership and almost beat David Lewis. Like, we're talking about an unbelievable movement of the youth radicalization, probably the most profound expression of the youth radicalization in North America, that you had young people taking on David Lewis, the most senior New Democrat and Labor leader in the country, and took him down to the last vote for the leadership of the NDP. Unbelievable.
We were trying to defend ourselves, our line, that is Ross, me, Harry.
We were not nationalists, that we were just supporting the nationalism of the waffle as expressing a fact, which is we were owned by foreign corporations.
Why the disagreements had to always become so deep and so wrenching in the organization, I never did quite understand that.
These debates became rancorous and you know, every tiny difference became multiplied into some major betrayal of the working class.
We saw our basic politics being removed. We had to separate ourselves. Nobody was listening, and we did it as an act of self-preservation.
So we did think if we split and are not encumbered by the ignorant anti-nationalism and that of the L.S.A., we did think we were going to hit good times, and we didn't realize we were in the best times. It was only going to get worse.
You unite or you split on the basis of current problems and current tasks, and you test your ideas. And then you maybe unite again because one side proves it's right. Or you don't split. You just agree to go along and let the majority test its ideas and even help them.
We just came to the conclusion that we had to leave the L.S.A., and we did.
We didn't consider that this split was forever. There was a phase we were going to go through.
So the lessons that come out of that is that you require a consolidated body, a professional body of people who know what they're doing and know what they want, how to get it, and they know how to work together, and they know how to override personal issues, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, political soldiers.
Because I do remember once saying to myself, as I was walking along in the early 70s, Trudeau was a prime minister and Bill Davis was the premier of Ontario. And I said to myself, this is as right-wing as this will ever be. And from our whole rest of my life, it's going to get more and more to the left. And of course, what I didn't know is that was as left-wing as I was ever going to see before I hit the grave, right? Like that was the high point.
But unfortunately, there was a real downturn, and then the socialist movement all across the line, and everybody declined.
So let's consider, could this League for Socialist Action have survived? Now there's a question that means a lot to all the comrades who went through that experience. And many of us would point to the advent of neoliberalism, the decline of the labor movement, the defeats on all fronts, over not just a few years, but over decades, creating much less favorable circumstances for the building of a socialist group. So perhaps it was inevitable.
The main reason for the failure of the left, though, I mean, a lot of it is our mistakes, but it is the imbalance, the asymmetry in access to the media, in access to the enormous resources that by then the unions and the right-wing party leaders or the Communist Party leaders even had. So we had much less resources to try to do this with. That was the main reason we failed.
But there are many reasons why people leave a revolutionary organization. They stop being revolutionary. They want to get on with their lives, they want to raise their children, they want to get jobs, And also the postponement of radical upsurge. If nothing's happening in the working class, it becomes much more difficult.
We were the politicals, we were the vanguard. No, I think it was wishful thinking, obviously, but I think we had lost our bearings a little bit when the anti-war movement came to an end.
The fact is that we were very political, but the world was not political and never has been and never will be.
The League for Socialist Action eventually did go down, but I don't think there was any need for that to happen. So summing it up, I think we have good reason to be pleased that the task of forming a cohesive pan-Canadian movement with roots in both Quebec and English Canada, with an outlook to the First Nations, that we were successful in this. It was stable, democratic, functioning well, and is a good model to look back on.
So it's good to be alive. It's good to be able to participate in this experience. And that's what I thought this celebration was about. The experience we're now undergoing. It's not a celebration of me. I'm part of the experience. We're adding to it. We're going to impel it forward. We're going to broaden it. And victory is going to be through humanity, against Wall Street, against the Kremlin, in favor of socialism, the socialist revolution. I drink to that.
Right. Now,
the idea of participating in single-issue movements was really antithetical to many people on the left. They wanted to run around carrying a red flag and waving a red book or something like that. And our view was no, people become radicalized through their own experience.
One of the songs that really united people
when we sang it and performed it were the songs from Morgentaler. And so I remember even Ross and people like that, and all the young people singing, why have they got the gold? Why have they got the power? Why?
All we need to do is to set aside our mental enslavement to the gods of capitalism.
Mara, we're poor, and the poor stay poor. Mara, don't make us wait anymore. We want our rights, and we don't care how. We want a revolution now. And all the comrades would have their hands up to the whole things. We want our rights. The whole place singing. And there were about 300 of us in those days. Oh, it was the best.
Life is not an easy matter. You cannot live through it without falling into frustration and cynicism, unless you have before you a great idea.